Good evening. It's an interesting time, I think, to get together to discuss some deep and profound subjects. And uh, I'm speaking on behalf of the Philosophical Musa blog, which I write, and looking to get some more um, discussions out there about some of the big subjects that we can be having. And this is the first of hopefully many. I'm delighted to have my friends Terry, Nina, and Connor with me. The I thought what we'd probably do is introduce ourselves as we speak, because you'll have a much better way of doing that than I would. So the first one we said would be about the existence of God, and so we'll start with a light topic, um, one that's been debated for millennia and has, I think, underpinning it one of the most fundamental truths of all kinds of discussions, and that is that we ought to always treat all of our subjects with the due complexity that they deserve. I think one of the biggest faults we make as humans is oversimplifying um, the arguments. And I've just realized I've muted all you guys for some reason. Let me just take you off that. Why are you on mute?
I did it myself to stop any background noise from getting in.
Oh, I see. Right. As the viewers will see, I'm clearly an amateur at Zoom, so forgive me. So they've muted themselves. That's very kind of them. They're very generous. Yeah. So the Christianity to me is the most complex subject with which we interface, because to believe that Christianity is the true religion, the true faith, is to say that everything else underpins that truth, that there's nothing outside of Christianity that would not have a bearing on whether Christianity is true or not. And I think one of the biggest things that's happened is there's been a lot of oversimplification of argument from both sides. There's a number of things about the Christian faith that I feel very peripheral to. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book. I'm writing several books. And the first one that I've finished is probably the one I'm most keen to propagate and to talk about, which is about God's genius. And the premise of the book is that we don't even begin to interface with something as complex as Christianity unless we consider that we are dealing with a subject of genius and a work of genius and a God who is ultimately what we would consider the genius of all geniuses, if you like. In the hierarchy of geniuses, this is what we have to contend with. And I think what was useful to me when exploring the faith and later on becoming a theist was to say that we have to give it its full gravitas. We have to approach this as though this is the most complex subject, and then the true rewards will start to manifest. So my book is about exploring various subjects to do with Christianity. The first section is all about the maths of the universe and the physics and various elements of what I call operation type thinking, which is the logical, which is the objective. And the second half of the book is what I call the character element of mind. So those are the two ways that with which mind interfaces with reality. And there's lots of overlap between the two, of course. So I started on those premises, and in the second half of the book begin to talk a lot about the genius of all the different subjects, which are metaphysical propositions, things like grace and faith and truth and forgiveness and storytelling and all these different things. So it's a really comprehensive work. It's about 400,000 words, so it may well need some editing, if not by choice, by dictate of the publishers, if anyone's kind enough to look at it. So that's probably a good place to summarize where I'm at with thinking about God. And I've had lots of conversations with atheists and believers own kind of all sorts of complex subjects. I guess I should say quickly why I think God exists, and I think before we even get to the theistic element. So if you're happy for me to do that, I'll just explain very briefly. I think it's important, if one believes in God, to arrive at a fundamental reason why one ought to believe in God. And that's certainly not to say that in order to encounter God, you have to approach it like you're exploring a work of genius. I'm not ever saying that's the case. I think there are so many beautifully simplistic ways that one can find God, and this is really for the people who want to go out there and say that this is a massively complex subject, and that they want to argue from both sides of the equation and really, philosophically put this to the test. So to those people who are most interested in that kind of a discussion, I think the first thing that fundamentally is true, which we really have to face, is that mathematics, the nature of mathematics, has an existence and an ontology that's way beyond even the physical structure of the universe. I use an analogy in my book that a lot of people used to think that the physics of the universe was like the territory we live in, and the mathematics was like the map, because we use mathematics for all kinds of equations in physics and chemistry and biology. But I argue that that's actually not the case. I think maths, because it has an existence that's more primary than physics, that maths is actually the territory and physics is more like the map. And in fact, we can't engage with reality except by being physical beings, of course. But if we didn't exist, those fundamental questions would still be true, I think, of mathematics. And the other thing about mathematics is that it doesn't actually make any sense without an up and running sentience. It's inextricable from thought itself. So we're leading there to something like mind being the primary ontology that we can having the necessary existence, and there's nothing in physics that is complex or sophisticated enough to have what's called a satiety, which is the existence that explains itself, whose non-existence would be a contradiction. So that's where I think the first signpost is with the nature of mathematics. And the second thing is that the universe itself has what I call a biased random walk. And that's a whole range of complex consideration, which we'll probably get into. But the way the universe behaves in what we call combinatorial space, which is a manner of search space for a number of different permutations, and the way that things can be, certainly since the observable universe and the Big Bang, its mathematics is skewed with a bias that clearly points towards something in the active information in the laws of physics, which tends towards the complexity and the order that we see in much later on stars and life. Of course, there's no life without stars burning out. So that is perhaps a good place to start in terms of saying, well, this is why I think there's a God before we even get to who that God is and what that God means and cares about us. That it seems evident to me that we can't easily escape the fact that the universe, and that's not the universe tends towards life with a mathematical skew that exhibits intelligence. And I write a lot about that in the first section of my book, which will be difficult to summarize here, I know. But so that's really the starting premise for, I think, why God exists. And it seems that whenever you lay that out, certainly in written debate, I've not seen anybody have anything to come back with that. in terms of denying that that is a reality that we're faced with. There are all sorts of reasons why they might otherwise reject the notion of God. But so that led me to theism, or certainly to an intelligence that one might classify as deism or theism. Does anyone want to come in there, or shall I carry on, or how do you feel?
I'm more than willing to let somebody else speak. I certainly have probably more than enough to say, but I would like to hear other people's ideas first, because I don't know what they have to say.
Well, then I suppose I should be courageous and give it a try. I don't think that we need God in order to have God, as I don't believe in the existence of God, but I do believe in the existence of the universe, you know, the existence of an idea, the existence of a supreme idea that holds all the answers. So for example, in physics, we can talk about the unified theory that can explain the entire universe, the laws of nature and everything. So I see that theory as God itself, right? Something so powerful that can explain everything else. Or from a mathematical point, we have the most beautiful shape in mathematics, which many mathematicians think is how God looks like, the tetrahedron, if I'm not mistaken. So we do have the idea of God both in philosophy, we have it in biology, we have it in psychology as well. And we use it. As an atheist, I am using God in my day-to-day life, even if I'm saying God does not exist. So I don't think, like liberty, I don't think we can get rid of God. And this is a good thing, even if we don't believe in it. So I let you gentlemen continue.
I'd like to make a quick comment to that, Nina, because a person I met a couple years back, good friend now, and we've done 2 shows a week actually on YouTube. He's taken the time off because he's had trouble, lots of family problems centering around COVID and issues like that. But he's a professor in the ancient languages, and he was born and raised in a Pentecostal church, and rather early in his life found himself falling out of that. But he has stated something that I would be remiss to not use his words, because he phrased it very well, and it dovetails nicely with what you said, Nina. He said that God is but an abstraction of an idea whereby we orient ourselves to have an organized society. And I love that. I mean, you know, it's one of those things that you have to hear it a few times before it starts to make sense. But the thing is that as Christians, you know, I live in a arguably, there's nothing Christian about the United States, but a lot of the United States thinks it's Christian. So therefore there is something Christian about the United States. But one of the most profound things I've ever done in my life, and I was on them when I was doing mission work in Mexico as a Pentecostal. I went down, I had the day to myself, and I drove out to the ruins of Teotihuacan outside of north of Mexico City, and I climbed the Pyramid of the Sun, and I sat down up there and I cried for probably a half an hour. I just, you know, because you have to look at this. And these people believed in a God, or gods, more correctly. They built the city, and in this city they did all sorts of things, and some of them were absolute moral abominations. But they did this because this is how they oriented themselves to have an organized society. I think that there's a pull that says, and maybe best described as otherness, and the Jewish philosophers, rabbis refer to it as an isness, a metaphysical connection, you know, an undeniable metaphysical connection to something that's as of yet indescribable. And I see that mostly for myself, and I'll be brief here, but I'll try to be brief and still explain the entire universe in a couple sentences. We have this fairly assumed event at this point in time that we can point at, and at the, I'm old enough to have lived through times when we didn't know many of the things that we do know today. And by no, I'm not going to go pedantic with the philosophical nonsense of we can't really know anything. Yeah, we can know some stuff well enough that we can call it knowledge. It does look like we had an initial expansion from a singularity. And in that expansion, you have plasma, disconnected atomic particles, subatomic particles, excuse me, that are blown out at insane speeds into a literal void, not into space, because space is what exists between matter. It blows out into an emptiness. And because it's doing that, it can do that at a crazy speed because there is no electromagnetic field putting the brakes on, which is what causes the speed of light to be a fixed speed limit in the universe. So this super hot disconnected atomic particles blow out into a void. Time passes. Time is irrelevant, but time passes. Something marks the time. And you think, well, I mean, it really does. Something actually marks the time. You think, well, what's marking the time? Well, atomic particle spin, the magnetic moment thrown off by electrons, which creates space itself. Eventually, you get atoms that come together, the simplest ones. They fall together under gravity. You know, these forces exist already; they're already there, or they're entrained in the subatomic. And we have gas clouds. We have, which condense further, that form stars. The stars condense to the point that they explode, and as they condense to iron is crazy quality to it, and they explode, and it spews out again. Now you've got heavier elements and that are created in that explosion, plus the elements that are now fusing and existent in the star. And this just goes on, and it goes on in not countless, but close enough to countless places throughout the universe. I was there when they started discovering more galaxies, you know. I mean, that was, in my mind, it was fantastic, amazing news. But through this whole thing, we don't have an inception for life. There's no point at which it makes sense for life to begin. And the thing that troubles me, and I don't claim that this is God, but the thing that troubles me the most, and the thing that gives me the most hope, is that somewhere, I like the way that Tolkien put it in the Silmarillion, you know, that somewhere in the depths of time, in the midst of the innumerable stars, this place was found, and life began. And it doesn't have to begin as Adam and Eve standing under a few trees and one they're not supposed to touch. That's a fable. But life begins, bacteria. And it builds its way up through billions of years, and it resolves itself to us sitting here having this talk right now on an internet that's being supported by alternating current, which is the hinkiest stuff you've ever imagined. You know, people think it's like DC. It's not. It's crazy complicated, but it's also just this. It's the music of the spheres at the same time. And here we are, and we're alive, and we're not just alive. We're not just sentient. We're sapient. We can recall history that we don't even know. We heard a story, and we recall the story, and we make it our own, and we can project. And I love this thing about Jordan Peterson, by the way. I heard you commented briefly about Peterson. He made this statement, and I thought, that's just silly. And then I thought, that's brilliant. We discovered the future. So now we make contracts with the future, sacrifice, if you will. We make contracts with the future to create the future that we envision, even though it doesn't exist yet. And we only live in the now, and we can never really even connect with the now with our senses because there's always a time lag. So we have this really wild and crazy ride but we know things anyway, and we expect things anyway, and we trust our history anyway. We do all that based on an instinctual knowledge that we're not wrong. And this is not necessarily the default position for every human on planet Earth. I wouldn't say that at all, but I'm seeing people who think, and people who are willing to set aside their predispositions and their sacred cows long enough to just want to know the truth for its own sake. You get to a point where you start to realize that this is a pretty crazy thing. And I just one quick plug here, that excuse is like the Drake equation. And the Drake equation is nothing but a logical fallacy. It's an unfalsifiable assumption that this can happen endless amounts of times whenever you bring these things together. And it could, but to assume that it's a truth is a crazy, it's okay, that's a harsh word. It's not justifiable. This may be the only life there is, and the better physicists would say the same. Which I think nothing else, it warrants some appreciation and respect for being here today. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that before I invite Connor in. I think I've had discussions with people who are skeptical, who say that we're possibly the only life in the universe, and doesn't that show what a cosmic fluke it is? And others who've said, well, we're bound to have a universe that's teeming with life, so therefore we can't be the special creation that God says he cares about in scripture. And I think as skepticism has evolved, it seems to me that they're demystifying the wonder that used to exist when science and faith were in its biggest conflict. The conclusions that they've currently reached, the ones that we're grappling with, is, which I've blogged about in each case, is the idea that the universe came from nothing, or that the universe is just one of possibly an infinite number of universes, or certainly very many, and that doesn't excuse us of the burden of contingency that I'm talking about in my book. It's just putting the problem back one step further. Let me invite Connor in now to give a thought or two.
Of course, thank you, James. Yes, I'm more on. I thought I was going to be the token atheist here, but it's good to see there's two of us at least, Nina. So it's 2 and 2. It's a good pairing. Yes, so I am. Yes, I say I'm an atheist, but I was raised very Catholic, and Ireland is. There's a lot of where I'm from. There's still a lot of cultural Catholicism around, even those of us who don't necessarily believe. So you would, even if you talk to me during the day, you'll find me using like religiously intoned language and things. You know, I'll often, obviously not just saying you know, oh God or oh Jesus or whatever as expletives, but also things like, oh, but for the grace of God, or in the eyes of man and God, that sort of thing, which I think is an interesting topic in itself, which is just how thoroughly Christianity has penetrated Western culture, at least. There's an awful lot to talk about there, but yes, I'm as I say, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I don't think James introduced me here, but that I'm a neuroscientist studying a PhD in neuroscience, and so I come from a lot of this from the perspective of minds and consciousness. And for me, like the human brain at least, is, as far as we know, the most thoroughly complicated thing in the universe that we've seen so far, at least. We're not even close to understanding the things we don't understand about it, that there's so much to it. It's such a wonderfully complex organism that it's the only thing that we know that thinks about itself, that has this internal sense of reality, and that at the end of the day we reduce it down to the activity of these neurons and these glial cells, which is just such it's a very mind-blowing thing to think about. But for me, I guess I interrogate all of this, I see everything, and I don't see the need for a God, for a deity to be there. And that there are more sort of specific objections that I have to ideas of souls and things like that we can maybe get into a little bit later. But for me, yeah, atheism is more of a negative proposition than a positive one. It's more like me not seeing a need for it and not seeing a question that is best answered by God, rather than me having a reason for affirmatively thinking there is no God. It's more of me thinking there isn't a particular need for it, so I just don't operate under the assumption that one exists then for that reason. But there's an awful lot to the universe that you can describe, I think, in almost divine terms. Like James and Nina, you both touched on just the beauty of mathematics, the poetry of mathematics. Is something that's quite incredible to me. But yes, and it has almost, I'm not sure would I call it a metaphysical quality, but it certainly has quite a unique beauty to it. And that there's things like this that can appear divine, but I think that if you drill down, you find them to be non-divine, and that is generally the way that I think about this sort of stuff. But as I say, I'm a scientist, so I'm a very, very skeptical by nature, and that's just the way I tend to approach the world in general. But yeah, that is my perspective, starting off at least.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the elements as well of the book is that we can't really get much further in discussing these big subjects if we don't look at them through the right lens of interpretation. And I've battled a lot of science unfriendly religious people in my time, and I'm a great lover of science, and it's part of the love of science that makes me believe it to be nested in deeper truths than the intrinsic nature of the object under discovery. Richard Dawkins makes a really bad error when he says that now we know all about evolution, that just basically gives God his redundancy notice because we now know how everything came about. And that seems to me to be a pretty crass way to rule out God. I'm not saying you've done that. I'm saying that the active information and the physics that we're talking about, and the very nature of the complexity of the skewed bias that we're talking about in nature, all the hard work's pretty much been done by the time we get to the stage of biological evolution. Once you start getting life, and I'm not saying that it's easy to get life, but once you do get life, and once it starts to get more complex, then most of the hard work, it's not that difficult to get a rich, diverse range of life that we do on this planet. And I think that story is one of the most beautiful things that we observe. And I think where we have to, if we say we can't see God because we can't see any need for him, I think what we're looking at really is a discovery of truth. And we'll find, I think, that truth underpins the things in which we think we can't see God. And maybe we can't see God as well because we have an interpretation that's been given to us by an oversimplification that we've inherited. And I say we, all of us, because as I said, if we don't approach this with the real gravitas that it deserves, then it's very easy for people to look at the world purely through a scientific lens and say, well, that's all I think we need because it tells me everything I think we can find out about the physical universe. And one of the more radical arguments I think in the book is that we can quite easily dispense with the physical universe and still be left with a number of questions to answer, a number of problems to solve, that were we not trapped in this, what I call the cognitive effigy, which is that we are physical beings. So the most we can really do is interpret the world through the lens of a physical interpretation. And Kant, of course, talked about that with his noumena and phenomena distinction, whereby we can't actually properly know the outside world only through the lens of our own interpretation. So I think there are powerful truths that underpin existence and underpin our narrative, of which science is a very powerful part of that. But I don't think it's enough to give God his redundancy notice. I think the work is still ahead of us in answering those even bigger questions, of which science is just a subset.
One quick thing I should have mentioned, and I knew that I missed it and I was going to wait, but since Connor, you made mention, and James, you've also made mention here, what I failed to state, I've said it enough times, I assume that I said it, and I went, I didn't say that, did I? I inferred it. Life has to start. The universe, something started the universe. It's an electromagnetic universe. Because I understand this stuff a little bit. I don't have letters behind my name. Something had to start the universe. It's an electromagnetic universe. It probably was started by some kind of electromagnetic induction, which means something that wasn't touching it started it. I don't expect to find the thing that started it inside of it. That's point number one. Second point is everything that's therefore inside of it is intrinsic to the universe, inherent with its processes and properties. And yet life doesn't start with the universe. It would be preposterous to think that life exists at the inception of the universe, unless it's something different, like one of the four fundamental forces. But it only seems to bear out on certain atomic and certain molecular levels. And it will, I mean, it's so basic, like a lot of things that are basic, that we lose how basic it is. And Connor, by the way, I'm not by any way inferring a theistic God. I'm inferring a sincere problem in logic here, because you can't start something that hasn't been started already unless it has causality, and there's something has to create that cause. And the fact that the universe got bored and formed a little back eddy, in its spiral toward along the way in the arrow of entropic time. I've heard people who write coffee table books say this, that life is just a little back eddy and it's just a quirk. It's a quirk, but I'm it, and so are you. So I would think that there would be a little less tepid desire to at least ask yourself a big question that you're probably never going to have an answer to. And that's I think the willingness we have to be willing to cast ourselves back against the backdrop of having such a big question that we know that we're going to live out our days and never have an answer, and be happy with that. And I'm happy with that, but the only way I ever got beyond theism and atheism, and I've been on both sides of that line at least twice, the only way I ever got beyond that to where I think I am today was by not caring what the answer was. I mean, I wasn't backing a horse in this race. It was, I don't care what the answer is, want the answer. And then I started to be able to see more of the things I was missing. Like I mentioned earlier before we started the show, that rocks just don't appear in a field somewhere. They don't, you don't just get canyons, you don't get oceans, you don't get mountain ranges. All this stuff has processes that brought it there geographically, or geologically more, I'm sorry. But life it has to have reason, or it's unreasonable. And that's fine if it's unreasonable. That means there's something we don't know. If it is reasonable, that means that there's something we can explain. And because we can back engineer to the point where, and then a miracle happens, be we theist or atheist, we have to backwards engineer to the point where we go, I have no idea why. And at that point, I mean, I've been studying virology a bit, because what else am I going to do with my time? And look at viruses and I go, that's just so wild. I mean, and these are things that live they're alive, say, at least real virologists say they're alive. but they're alive at a level that we just, they require other things. So the other thing has to exist before the virus can exist. And I mean, all this interconnectedness, it has to have a start. And that's not saying that God is, gracious and bountiful and wonderful, because there are a lot of really awful things out there in the world. But I'm sorry, I thought I was going to be quicker than that. All I was stating when I was saying that thing about life's a predicament is that life is really a predicament. That we can't, it's the rock we can't pick up, and no matter how hard we try.
Yeah, I'd just like to chime in on a little something there. You say viruses being alive. I like to call them undead. I like to take a middle position. That there's one of the good ideas of where viruses came from was they were at one point a more complex thing, but then regressed. Well, not so much regressed, but changed until they became what they are now, where they always have to be
zombie particles.
So yeah, they're zombies basically. Yeah, I like to think of them as undead, which is a bit of a cop-out answer, I think, but that's one. Yeah, so the question of life. So you mentioned some people sort of describe it as a quirk. Yeah, I think that sort of language isn't very helpful when, like, some people say, "Oh, life is just an accident." It's like, well, if it is, it's a hell of an accident. It's a very, very big, very meaningful one. And I think using this sort of dismissiveness when talking about where life has come from, often just in function to try and sort of say, "Oh, this isn't an issue really. Like, life isn't something that's." We particularly need to explain the existence of when, you're writing, I don't know, your coffee table book on why there is no God or whatever it is. Yeah, life is a very big thing to explain. Life is a very, very complicated thing. And you can't just dismiss it as an accident, certainly. But yes, so the point as to where it comes from, where it starts, how does life come from? Not something we have the answer to right now, of course. Abiogenesis, whether it happens, how frequently it happens, not something we have the answer to, but it is something that it's a problem, again, like I said before, it's a problem that I don't think requires God to answer. Or at least I haven't been persuaded of that. And while life is certainly a deeply complicated thing and a very, very important, very majestic thing in the universe, that it doesn't quite get me to the point of theism, to see everything that's here. The natural physicalistic processes are sufficient for me, at least so far, to appreciate the existence of life.
I've got one thing to say, but Nina, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was thinking of life in general. What if life is God, being born with every generation, being recreated, it's never dead and never alive, always is. So life itself as God, it has a will, the will of surviving, that you are an insect. If you find yourself in danger, you're going to escape. So the will to reproduce, to recreate, it's something that is instinctive, both in us, in them, in everyone. So why not God as life and consciousness itself? Does the universe has a consciousness itself? Because then will be the definition of God. But then as humans, at least personally, why do I actually need God? And the answer is, well, I need redemption. I need forgiveness. I need to agree with the people around me. I need to integrate. So I need to adjust my behavior to their behavior, right? So this is where God comes into, maybe for some people gives to certain people, it's essential in giving them morality. It's enough for me, Socrates, I think that's good enough. But Socrates doesn't give me redemption or forgiveness, which you do have if you like, from other people and therefore from God, So I don't know. I think we absolutely need the idea of God, but we do not need the idea of religion, where indeed it moves us far away from God because we are looking for redemption and forgiveness, not to other people, right? If I do something wrong, I should be forgiven and redress the situation with the person that I've wronged with, that I had the issue with. It's not with God that I have to solve nothing, I mean, my past experience showed me that I was a way harsher critic than God will ever be. And for the mistakes that I've done, I was a child, and I've done many mistakes. And when you get to be 19 and you start to have consciousness and you start to realize the implication of your actions and the consequences of it, and, remorse and feelings and the need to peace, and you go in a church and you still don't have that because you're too ashamed to truly confess, because it's just too intimate to go and have that type of conversation with a priest, and then you come home and then, God, let me talk to you directly, and I need redemption. And you realize that the only forgiveness that you need is your own. As I said, I was a way harsher critic than God will ever be with me, if God exists. And that's the reason why I've become an atheist, through I felt like 19 years old when I was still in remorse for all the mistakes that I committed and all the sins that I committed, because I grew up in this with religious belief and thought. So I was feeling shame and guilt and all these nasty feelings. And I was looking for forgiveness, and that forgiveness come for me, but at a pact, you have to die and be reborn as a new person. So the idea of dying and being reborn again, it's more psychological than literal. And I needed that. I needed to kill the old Nina so that a new one, a better version of Nina, can live, in peace and in a bit happier, in a healthier way, instead of recreating a hell for myself each and every day, So psychologically, we do need God. That's the way I think, even if I truly believe God does not exist. And if I would have to continue from here, just short and fast, I think if God is life, which I believe it is, and life is reproducing continuously, then God is making God. We are gods. So the idea of a one single God, it's a bit of an idea that I cannot accept, because the biggest power of God should be that to make other gods. So I don't know, maybe I'm a heretic in here, but I'll let you continue.
No, I think you've touched on some really important things about a hierarchy of values and truths and qualities that humans have. You and Connor too touched on life, and it certainly isn't what we call a fluke, but it's certainly a long way forward in the story. I mean, before life, the as you probably know, nothing apart from hydrogen, helium even could exist until stars burned out. So everything that we are is stardust. We probably have atoms that were in different stars, and that's a remarkable trajectory for the universe to have taken. On the surface, it's easy to look like, I mean, that actually looks rather like an accident, or certainly it looks like it isn't divinely inspired, doesn't it? You might say, well, that's a strange way for God to do his creating, particularly when you look at the Old Testament stories about creation, which are very much more teleological and deliberate in nature, which is where we get the awful creationism from, of a literal Old Testament stories like Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark and Tower of Babel and that sort of thing. And you touched on about the universe being, you said you sort of said thinking, as though the universe has come alive.
As a consciousness,
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. Well, I don't think that's really far from the truth, because George Berkeley, one of the idealist philosophers, he thought that existence itself is inextricable from God's mind. He thought that the whole thing was mind, and the reality, the creation that we see and are part of, are thoughts in God's mind. And I think when trying to explore the nature of mathematics, which can't be part of creation, or certainly can't be part of the physical universe and be just that, as far as I can see, I think God is naturally triune in nature, and I think, certainly according to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit of Christianity. So it seems that we can't even have thinking itself without a mathematical substrate underpinning that, because there isn't really a way to think without having mathematics, without having the concept of value in mathematics. And I think where we might be able to touch base together with what you've said is the qualities that you're talking about, which I think are absolutely valuable and so essential to the human narrative and the human journey. I think what they are is human ideas that tap into a series of values which have a hierarchy, and that we can keep going up the hierarchy and we can keep improving our ideas. And that is actually what we're doing in terms of discovering God.
Indeed.
You and I we call ourselves libertarians, don't we? Because we value the nature of a bottom-up approach. We value the fact that actually when things emerge by trial and error, by competition, by thought and reason and innovation, that some of the most valuable things that can happen come up that way. In fact, one might say in economics, the vast majority of them do. And that is part of what the Greek called it autopoiesis. It's the idea that you mentioned of nature sustaining and creating itself. And scripture, from a theological lens, seems to support that, with the notion of God not wanting the kind of dominion that just is micromanaged, but actually, although it may seem that way sometimes from the Old Testament verses, but some of them at least, but it's God giving what Pascal called the dignity of causality. It's God saying, I'm going to create something astounding. And with, as Terry mentioned, with the start of creation comes the start of time and space. And as Einstein showed us, that those two are inextricably interlinked, and that we know of things that act outside of seemingly the observable universe that are causing the universe. I wrote a blog once called "Is God Pulling the Universe?" because it seems very much like it's being pulled rather than pushed. So I think that's a kind of a combination of ideas that play into what you're talking about, that we keep discovering and we keep tapping into things that are far more profound than us. And as you said, we are tapping into concepts like grace and like love and like forgiveness and like goodness that are way more powerful than anything that could be a more banal interpretation, and from a purely physical perspective, I think there's definitely a challenge with physical interpretation, as Connor would say, with neuroscience, because you can do all sorts of things to the brain, can't you, Connor? And it can make it look like this is all very much on a neurological knife edge. You can induce feelings of God. You can, as Connor will tell us more, you can intervene with people's moral compass, can't you? You can do all sorts of crazy things, and at that level, it does look like we are very susceptible to the notion of having these things dismissed for that reason. But I think the truths that underpin us are transcendent. I'll just say one more thing quickly, because I think it's probably a good time to say it. You may have, some of the friends of mine on Facebook, which you guys are, you may have seen once I wrote an article talking about the things I'm most certain about. And the way I measured that was to say, well, if these things turned out not to be true, then how surprised would I be? How shocked would I be to find out that actually the things I think are true are not true? And I talked about the concept of existence is, which Terry's mentioned, that we can't deny that things exist. So existence is a thing, even in a more than the Descartes, I think therefore I am. There's thinking going on, and there is existence, and the nature of mathematics. And down the line a bit, we get to things like the consistency of the natural numbers, and we get to all the scientific truths. And one thing that I think that's really interesting, which taps into what Nina was talking about, values and almost living and embodying the kind of things that Christianity espouses, is imagine if we found out that we'd got the order of Roman emperors wrong. So we'd say we'd got Nero and Augustus mixed up now, about how long ago they lived. We would be quite surprised at that, because there's a lot of history that backs up their ages and their origins. But we wouldn't be so fundamentally surprised that our world would cave in. We just revise our historical narrative a bit. And equally, if we found something out about the scientific principles, even something really fundamental that we've relied on, we would find a way to redress our errors, and we would reconstitute them into better understanding. We do that quite a bit anyway, with certainly over centuries. But one thing that I thought was really interesting about values, which I mentioned in this, is that if somebody said to us, actually, you've got your values wrong, they're actually opposite to what you thought, that truth is no longer superior to falsehood, good is no longer superior to evil, fact is no longer superior to falsehood and fiction or counterfactual, we wouldn't even know what that means. We wouldn't even know what reality is anymore. And one of the arguments I make on the basis of that is, we can say that morality has evolved, and we can say that these values are evolved, and they are to some extent, through a certain lens of interpretation. But quite why they are so absolute and so immutable that we couldn't even imagine a reality that's any different, with different types of values being turned on their head, is, to me, something quite astounding. It's as though we are, with all our own construction of values, we are tapping into something that's far grander and far more numinous and ineffable than we can possibly comprehend. And I think there's something profound about that sort of taps into an underpinning truth that we may well be exploring with our narrative.
Yeah, I might hop in off the back of that there, James, if you don't mind. So yes, I'm glad you bring up the first of all, the topic of how people's values, depending on that there's experiments we can do that will change the way people reason morally, that will change the way they think about things. And a lot of this is quite simple stuff. I mean, you can do things like there's like transcranial magnetic stimulation you can do, which is quite a heavy-handed way of doing things, but where you can basically literally change the way people's brains are operating. But there's other simple things you can do. So like I think one of the easiest examples that I think we talked about at one stage before, James, actually, is that if you put someone in a room with something that smells disgusting, their moral sense will change. But they will tend to be harsher, they will tend to be more punitive. They'll, for example, they are more likely to think the death penalty is justified if you put them next to something, to some rotting fish or something like that. That a lot of these things are, and I think that's quite it's quite an entertaining result, first of all, you know, that you can do this sort of stuff. But I think it's it really speaks to, I think that morality, James, you touched on the evolution of morality. Something I would say about those supreme values is that we can't do anything but interpret values as human minds. And from a physicalist sort of perspective, the human mind emerged in a particular evolutionary context. There's a lot of different ideas of how different mental faculties arose, but one of the more popular ones that exists now in philosophy of mind, the evolutionary approach, is that it's basically a series of hacks that, you know, it just sort of, evolution has a way of doing things that it's just like, oh, you find what works, and if it works, that's fine. And that's how you can have things like morality overlapping with disgust senses, and where you can get things like people who have particular conditions, particular neurological conditions, can have different ways of seeing the world. Like one of the easiest ones to think of there is someone who has synesthesia will have their senses crosswired. Basically, you know, they can see sounds and things like that. And that on other kind of deeper levels, you can have people who have just ablated senses of morality almost entirely, which is quite a terrifying thing, but those people do exist. And all of this sort of points to me of these values being fundamentally human, as opposed to now whether that precludes God or is anything to do with that is a kind of a bit of a separate discussion, but I think they're very deeply human values, and that they are products, they're something that is quite integral to the human mind. And that the reason we might find it almost impossible to imagine, because it's a very good point you make, James, that it's almost impossible to imagine someone telling you that no, it's not actually, truth isn't actually better than falsehood. You're mistaken about that. It's very hard to imagine what a world where that was correct would be. It's almost a contradictory thing on some level, that it's, but even like that, there's no particular reason why being good is better than bad. Actually, it's the other way around, and that you're just wrong about that. But that I think that speaks to that we can only think about these things as human minds, and that we can get that from a kind of a human-centered perspective. I think it's just that there's no other way of thinking about them but as humans. It's a bit of it's sort of like an anthropic principle for values and for the way that we think about things, is that we can't help but think about things but as humans, and that if there's other minds in the universe, there's a very, very well written book just by the name of Other Minds, actually, which talks about the way cephalopods think. So octopuses in particular are very intelligent and very strangely intelligent things, but it kind of posits the idea of minds that emerge in a completely different evolutionary context, that they could have almost no ability to understand our values because they can't think as humans do. Obviously, we don't know of the existence of other minds, so this is complete conjecture. The only minds that we know are minds are human minds. But then you could even take that in the other direction, that, for example, there's some things that I would struggle to square away with there's some aspects of, say, the Christian God that I find difficult to comprehend. But one of the responses I've gotten before is like, well, you can't think like God, you can only think like a human. So that's just something that's not accessible to you. so that we're only able to deal with, by definition, we can only think of things the way that our minds are, and that another type of a mind is, can we ever understand that? Maybe the answer is no. Like you're stuck with the mind you have, and that you can only think with the mind you have, so you can only understand minds that are your type of mind.
Can I toss something in real quick here, Connor?
Yep.
I wanted to comment on something that Nina mentioned as well, but to what you just said first. 25 years ago, on December 23rd, I went ice skating. I woke up 3 days later in intensive care. I had fallen, hit the back of my head, did severe damage to my brain, severed my olfactory. Never recovered my sense of smell. I couldn't see for a while. It was pretty bad. It was a pretty bad couple of months, during which I wanted to die. I mean, I just sincerely wanted to die, and I didn't get my wish. And then I got better, but I never recovered my sense of smell. So you mentioned that, and it's the easiest sense to lose and with a crowd. But you wouldn't believe the number of times people reference, "Hey, do you smell that? Do you?" And things like it. And you go, and it's like going up to a blind person and constantly asking what they think this looks like. I have I remember being able to smell, but that's all. I don't even have a memory of what it's like. So yeah, to live without a sense, it's kind of it drives one into philosophical tailspins at times, because you come to realize how dependent our conclusions are based on just our senses, for one thing. And you mentioned the other thing about mind, and what you may have caught me here looking like I was distracted, as I'm reasoning with a 9-year-old German wire-haired pointer, the most intelligent dog I've ever met in my life, who was being busy today, being tormented by the fact that the farmer who has no muffler on his tractor was driving up and down the field across the road 100 yards away, like a little. I could almost imagine him saying vroom, 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 because it wasn't making enough noise with the machine, and the dog is just going, "I can't stand it." And we communicate, but we are breaking our communication is along the lines of Wittgenstein spoke of, that we'll never really connect, but that doesn't mean we don't communicate. I can't believe I'm not communicating with the mind, because it's pretty darn silly. I'm not talking to a rock here. I'm communicating with what most would argue as a sentient being. She lacks the human spin on that. And so just that's one thing. And Nina, you said two things. I think one thing is really cool that you mentioned, about life as it is. If you've never read it, find it and take a look at it. It's a long poem, Ray Bradbury's Christus Apollo, where he talks about humanity, coming to its own and then launching out to the stars to bring life to other planets in the universe, which is it's a very altruistic and hopeful little tale, but it's also very humbling. And it takes yes, it's poetry, but it takes things to a much more, I think, a much more honest level. It doesn't claim to know something, it just claims to be observing something. The other thing you mentioned is something about needing forgiveness, and I get that. I mean, I was confirmed by the Lutheran church that I was raised in when I was 13 years old, at which point I became a devout atheist because I didn't want to hear that crap anymore. Well, that left me with this moral quandary of being and I was in Minneapolis, and you see the glimpse of Minneapolis in the last couple of years on the news. It was like that then too. In that mess and trying to be a moral being, I was trying to be more moral than the church that I left. And I understood, date myself here, but John Denver wrote a song, Rocky Mountain High, and he talked about seeking grace in every step he took. And that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to seek grace in spite of no belief in God. I was looking to take my steps carefully and measured, and I knew that I would leave I would leave a footprint, so I was trying to be careful in how I took those steps. I became far more moral outside of the church than I did inside of the church, where they were telling me to do things. And my later foray through the church again, which is something we can maybe talk about some other day, but I got in there by a different means, but I left again for the same reasons, basically, because I found people who were pretending. And I've never been pretending. I've been confused and I've made mistakes, but I've never been pretending. And that goes back to that redemption thing. And there I reference one more thing. If you haven't seen it, it's worth the trouble to look. It's a kind of not highly celebrated movie called The Big Kahuna. 3 salesmen, one young guy who's a Christian, 2 older people who are worn out, are at a sales convention in one of these, it is flyover. Minnesota's not flyover. They were in a flyover state, just a big flat land with a city in the middle of it. And, just a bunch of people aggregate there because what else are you going to do? And they were there to send this pitch to the Big Kahuna, and this Christian wanted to push his Christian ideas on this guy. And all the salesman wanted to do was just do your job. And then the end of that movie, and you can look it up on YouTube, it's about a 5-minute long clip. Danny DeVito closes the thing out he pulls this kid aside at the end of this whole thing, and he lectures him about character. And he said, you asked me earlier about character. He says, if you want to know my honest opinion, you have none of it. And he says this, because, and the young person says, well, you mean I have to make mistakes? He says, no, you've made enough mistakes already. You just haven't owned them yet. And he said, the thing to have character is you pick up those mistakes and you make them part of yourself. And they paint themselves all over your face. It changes how you do the next thing. I'm not saying that to you, Nina. I'm just saying for myself.
Yep.
When you said that, it brought up this thing when I realized that I was responsible was when I became an atheist. When I didn't have this get out of jail free card that said, well, now all you have to do is confess your sins to Jesus and he'll just wipe the whole thing clean. You can go out and do the other next stupid thing you're going to do. I have a metal hip. I have a titanium hip because I found out I couldn't fly. I did not try flying again. I just plummeted, hit the concrete and lived. But I didn't do it again because I picked myself up more or less and got my new titanium hips and then learned how to walk again, because you can't get away from some mistakes you make. And then the moral mistakes are a little easier to have the fudge factor, but I think they infect our mind more. But there's something about owning it and going, that was wrong for me, nothing, if no one else, because it bothers me, so I'm not going to do that again. And I'm God, I don't want to, I'm not trying to be some moral lecturer here, but I found it really incredibly useful to recognize that. And the thing that I found in the church that I found just reprehensible was this constant assurance that you can just go out and you can hurt people, you can be offensive, you can fail to be charitable, and all you got to do is go sorry, and then the whole thing's wiped clean, and you're good to go for another week. And various denominations handle that differently, but many of them handle that, and all the people are looking for is that get out of jail free card. And what I found that the universe doesn't grant those. And I think that at the risk of whatever it brought me to today, I've been brought to today because I came to some point in my life, or points in my life, where I realized I didn't get a do-over, and it changed how I handle now.
Yeah, I think the universe does grant us that, forgiveness card, as long as we, metaphorically speaking, kill ourselves and be reborn again as a new being, which is still a hard price to pay. It's not something easy to go through and admit, yes, I've been doing something silly. Yes, I do need to be reborn, to die and be reborn. I think that issue with God is how do we interpret God for ourselves, and then how do we communicate with each other, knowing that not everyone is going to think the way we do. So, we have free to believe in God, free not to believe in God, but I think we do need the scale to say when God is too much or when God is not enough. Considering we do have different religions, some of them, they are still living like 2000 years ago, when the woman is being stoned to death because for whatever reason. So then I think the idea of God is too much in there. So it's like, how do we bring it in balance so we can, all believers and non-believers, can agree with each other and still be productive and still respect each other. The reason why I like the idea of God is that it finds an intrinsic value in each individual, which it's very hard to find anywhere else. And I do appreciate that concept very, very much. Even in the poorest of us, there is an intrinsic value in it. It's very hard to say that for a psychopath, but there is an intrinsic value in that too, at least, for us to learn from the mistakes of others. I don't know. So I think we should scale. We should decide when is too much and when is too little, and how that will impact the interactions that we have with each other. Are we going to see others as less just because they don't believe in God? Like the common mistakes, oh, you're an atheist, therefore you have no morality, which is like, it's like, no, that is not the case. Or I am a believer, I believe in God, therefore I hold, no, I cannot make any mistakes because God is on my side, when actually that's not the case either. So I would like to be, a bit of an engineer here. And how do we do in such a way that we can all respect the individual, and the stages that we go through, where we believe in God, we don't believe in God, now we believe, now we don't believe again, and accept that fallacy, and I don't know, call it a fallacy or humanity or being human, or I think that's what I would like to mainly solve when we talk about God.
Yeah, that was one of the things that attracted me to the Christian faith. I think we've all, listening to you guys, we've all had issues with organized religion and the church that we've been in, which has led us outwards, I think, to the periphery, if not religiously, then at least psychologically and possibly more too. There's a movie made in the 20s, I think, a German movie called M by a director called Fritz Lang, and it's about a villain who, I suppose one might call him a pedophile now, but it's implied, but it's not explicitly established. But he's certainly a very sinister man who's at least killed children, if not sexually abused them. And Fritz Lang does something very clever, because he's just about the first person I've seen in film who showed the narrative from the perspective of the protagonist. He has baying mobs after him all the way through the film, but it tries to give someone who would normally be vilified by the masses, often rightly so, but certainly for what they've done, but it gives him a humanity. And what attracted me to the Christian faith at the beginning, and I came into it from a studying just about every other subject first and believing that there may well be a God, but certainly not making that leap into the relationship with Christ. One of the things, again, touching on the libertarian thing, is that it's the first and most powerful religion that gives real sovereignty to the individual. And I think that's part of what it means to be made in God's image. There are various types of love that we know about, different types of love that the Greeks used, and the love of the agape love, which is the self-sacrificing, the parental love, which underpins the grace of the gospel, there's something profound about that goes beyond all of the other things that you associate with love. It's a very powerful bond, and it's a very powerful connection. And what drew me to Christianity, as opposed to anything else that we could explore, is the idea that God created the universe and came down to live as a man and suffered and died for everybody to equalize humanity, and to say that there's nothing anyone can do that can make God love us less or more, which is a quote from Philip Yancey. And that it almost gives us a sense of personhood that goes way beyond the more gritty, profane studies of matter and the universe. And it has metaphysical concepts within it, like obviously a very famous one about forgiving your enemies, which is a very powerful thing to even contemplate. Here's our God on the cross, being beaten, tortured, about to, and I mean, if you don't know much about crucifixion, it's just about the most painful and torturous way you could ever be put to death, isn't it? And here is God almost begging people to understand that they're forgiven, that they know not what they do. And that, I think, reading the subtext of that, and this is where I get my vibrations of economics and psychology and all of the things that I really value, which is a sense of liberty, that everyone's equal. And actually, if you look at trying to forgive your enemies, for example, the people that have wronged you most, the fact that everyone's under undeserved grace, this is the Christian story, that it really does equalize everybody at a level that grants them the kind of power and sovereignty that I've never encountered before. And I think, yeah, I think you're right that you're not likely to find that kind of gravitas easily in church. You're gonna, the first church I joined, I felt it was very middle class and it was very judgmental, and I thought, you guys are supposed to know the secrets of the universe. You claim to know the creator of the universe, which is a very powerful thing to know. And you're repelling me. You're drawing me more in the other direction. And that's one of the inspirations, I think, for my work, is to say, well, let's try to transcend that. And as you say, Nina, you'll see all sorts of absolutely ludicrous things and wicked things in the name of God, and how does one hope to access the deeper truths if the PR for that is some of the most opprobrious and ridiculous and crazy lunatic behavior you'll see. And I think that's one of the big challenges, and that's why I say at the start that unless you treat this, unless anybody treats this as though it's the most profound, the most astounding level of goodness, of truth, of morality, then, as you say, we could just end up with some kind of watered down or some kind of banal religion that would put all of us off. And I think with the physical things that Connor's talking about, it is a challenge because, as you say, you can induce things in the human brain that Christianity almost tries to monopolize and say, well, these are the products of a divine majesty, and yet you can alter someone's moral state. I've read before about the link between moral disgust and physical disgust, and there's even discussion about that's how some forms of moral thinking even evolved, because it induced this kind of disgust reaction. And that all may well be true. And I think these are the big challenges that we are facing, that actually for everything that's majestic and awe-inspiring, there is a way to look at it that is ultimately explicable through some kind of neuroscientific analysis. But I don't think that's ever the big mystery, really. I think, as I've said, I think whatever we describe through the physical nature of matter, whatever we describe through this complex thing called consciousness that we can never actually fully understand because of the first person problem, it's actually impossible to ever fully capture what it is like to be a mind only from the first person perspective, and that's profound in itself. So whatever we study about the mind from a third person perspective, we're only ever seeing it from the scientific lens, and which is only, as I said before, a very limited interpretation. It's a grand one, but it doesn't get us close enough to the big questions, only some of them, and only then partially. And I think, just to finish on that, I discussed before, often with Tim, actually, who's not joined us tonight, but I've discussed this whole thing about how over-engineered we seem for mere evolution. There's no question that we are evolved beings over billions of years, and obviously humans a lot younger, but we all share a common ancestry at least once. And there are things in the human organisms that are much older than our species. But there's something about the things that I think Christianity taps into that transcend anything that we could possibly construct through a scientific or even philosophical explanation. And I'll finish with something I really like from the Narnia tales, which is probably a good place to invite you in, where C.S. Lewis, obviously Aslan is the Christ figure in Narnia, and they're talking about whether the Aslan is invented, whether it's all made up. And he says, it seems to me that even if we have made this stuff up, our play world licks your real world whole, that it's so profound and so astounding. Even if it isn't true, it's far more astounding than anything that we've discovered by so-called natural means. I'm not saying that would ever be a reason to believe. St. Paul says, we should be pitied if we've got this wrong. But he says, I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't an Aslan to believe in. I think that's really fascinating. I think, tapping back to what Nina said earlier, I think my challenge to you guys, particularly Connor and Nina, is you are acting and living as though God exists, whatever you do, and you are involved in a narrative that acts as though Christianity is the truth. And I think that's one of the profound things that I discovered at the beginning when I felt that even if Christianity wasn't true, by means of the miracles in the New Testament and all of the supernatural stuff, the truths it proclaims are more profound than any other truths that I've encountered. and I would still live as though Aslan existed and he was right, even if I suspected he might not.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make there, James, because that was something that I've been thinking about throughout this discussion. And but just a little thing I'd like to say before you mentioned the issues we've had with organized religion, and you're like how a particular church might be, not seem to deal with the gravity of them knowing God, supposedly. I have no idea where this line comes from, but one I heard before was, I don't object to the concept of a deity, but I am baffled by the idea of a deity that takes attendance. It's like, yeah, you're thinking of God as like this school principal who's like scolding you for not being in class. That's the sort of level that some of these churches can get to. It's like, oh, God is objecting to you not sweeping your front yard. It's like, I'm not sure you're kind of at the right level of appreciation of this thing. But an interesting thing you mentioned there about like how if you live, you mentioned that like myself and Nina live as though we are Christians, or that sort of idea. That there's a very interesting book written by Tom Holland, by a historian, not by the actor who plays Spider-Man, but by the historian Tom Holland, Dominion. And it is basically a grand history of Christianity and how Christianity influences the Western, so-called the kind of Western mind, this kind of whole, that kind of civilization that you can draw from kind of the formation of Christianity up until now. And he has like an interesting point about how there's lots of people who would consider themselves, maybe they don't particularly consider themselves religious or non-religious, but they're, people who are fundamentally operating on secular modes of reasoning. And that, you might say, they would talk about things like, for example, they're talking about some issue and they'll invoke the notion of human rights. And he mentions how it's very, very difficult to get to human rights from a non-Christian perspective, that is a very loaded idea. The idea of moral equality between all humans, and that there is something that all humans share, and that there are certain rights and autonomies that each individual human has, irrespective of their status or who they are, where they've come from. And he makes a very decent argument that is quite a Christian thing, and that there's some people who've dropped, well, I say some people, I'm one of them, who have dropped the Christianity of it all, but still have these beliefs that are clearly quite influenced by Christianity. Even if they're not Christian anymore, they clearly came from Christianity. And for me, it's very similar to what I mentioned about how I can't help but think as a human. The fact that I was raised Christian, and that I'm in a culture that was clearly so strongly influenced by Christianity. These ideas, you can find little Christian fingerprints in all sorts of ideas. And like, that is just one very strong case he makes about the idea of each human being an individual who has their individual rights, that it is a violation to interfere with those in any way. But that is a very loaded and very Christian idea, and it is the Christian idea of every individual being equal in the eyes of God, being made in God's image, and that trying to strip Christianity out of that idea is a very, very difficult thing to do. So a lot of us do operate sort of with, like, the way you said it was the way we operate as though Christianity is true. I'm not sure would I go quite that far, but we certainly operate with a set of ideas that have a lot of Christian influence in them. Certainly if you're someone who is in a kind of Christian influenced culture. So, I think it's something to think about if you are a non-Christian, and if you're a Christian as well, just that, like, how many of these ideas that are seemingly secular. I mean, Tom Holland also makes a very good case that the very idea of secularism is actually a Christian idea as well, and that it's very difficult to strip all of that out, that you're kind of tossing the baby out with the bathwater, that a lot of these ideas maybe don't make as much sense without that sort of backdrop, and that, if you kind of think of it in a very practical, functional sort of way, you might say, well, say you were a person who does not believe in God, does that mean that all of these ideas need to go as well? Do you need to re-justify them all over again, or do you just sort of say, well, I like these things, so I'm just going to keep them, and yeah, I suppose we'll just keep the concept of God then as well, because it's instrumentally useful for us to have the notion of human rights and not have to re-justify it from what sort of basis? Maybe there's none that can do that, but it is an interesting idea.
I just want to come in there because this is the only time I could really do that, I think, with what you've said. There's something that I often say, which actually makes a lot of other Christians, if not most Christians, nervous. I have a set of beliefs that aren't that mainstream, and one of which is that if you take God out of the picture and imagine that there isn't a God, say, I think most of the things that we value and even attribute to some kind of Christian origin, we could have thought up with this kind of evolutionary trajectory that we've had. So I'm actually one of the Christians who's very reluctant to use a sort of God of the gaps argument in terms of culture and psychology and morality, and say that, and of course the worst thing that you can ever hear from a Christian is that you need God to be moral, which is actually, I think, a profound thing if you explore it to its full depth, but superficially it's not a very good argument. But there's something interesting if you look at how God interacts according to the scriptures in the Old and New Testament, which I think is really profound, which is that if you look at all of the things, or all of the significant things that the scripture writers say is God's way of interacting with them, then, and this goes back, Nina, to our bottom up quality, which we really value. So something like giving Adam the opportunity to name the animals, or animal sacrifices, which is an ancient Hebrew tradition which goes way back, older than the writings of the Old Testament, and then crucifixion, which we've mentioned, and various other things, morality itself, the Ten Commandments. What I think a lot of Christians miss is that they've got the causality backwards, that God is taking our evolution, he's taking things that we've either discovered or thought up or instituted formally, like a moral code, like animal sacrifice, when we were still polytheistic and way before, we even became monotheistic, which obviously is the right way around, and then something as barbaric as crucifixion. So it's not that God has said, hey, I want you to sacrifice animals for me, or I want you to crucify people, of course. It's that he's taken something that we've constructed and he's used it to, in the case of crucifixion, he's used the most brutal thing to save the world. And I think there's something utterly profound about that. And this is why I would be very cautious with your chap, Tom Holland, and as a Christian, to not fall for that kind of stuff where you say, well, actually, human rights is a great idea. So is various types of moral precepts and different types of liberty and whatever, because I think we probably could come up with most of those ourselves. I think,
I agree with that completely.
Yeah.
I personally think we could, yes, but it's just, it's interesting to think of the Christian origins or influence in how those ideas actually emerged in practice.
But I think what we're left with, it's the things that we can't come up with ourselves, and that's where we'll find the pathway and the signpost to God. And that's obviously long and complex too. But so just to add that, I'm happy that we invented so many things that often Christians like to claim as their own. But I think the causality is also that God used a lot of the best things we've come up with, because they are, like as C.S. Lewis says, shadowlands. They are aspects of reality that tap into what God is.
Well, I don't want to walk over the time here, Nina, and if you want to say something, please do. But I just wanted to say something quickly here, that what you're talking about is interesting. I appreciate, Connor, that you're bringing up dare say the obvious. You don't have to know who built the building to recognize the building has a foundation. You don't have to necessarily agree with the engineer who put it together to recognize it was done. And one of the things that troubled me a lot, like listening to Sam Harris, was that, and the ironic thing is that Jordan Peterson was trying to soft pedal he hadn't learned to be quite as bold as he is today. He was trying to soft pedal himself when he was debating with Harris, because he was just trying to say to Harris, it doesn't matter if you think we could have done it without Christianity as a basis. We didn't. We will, maybe the next time we do humanity on a planet, we'll try it without that and see how that works out. But this particular thought experiment, which has been running for billions of years, this is how this one worked. We came up with this religion thing, and some of them were rather dreadful. And we have some, I still wonder, and I'm just going to be blunt here. Only so blunt, though. I'll be blunt with padding. There's a particular religion that isn't anywhere near as magnanimous as Christianity in the world today. I'll let you fill in what that one is. It covers a big portion of the planet, and it gets the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more treatment. And you go, no, but they put women in bags and treat them like property and treat children like property. And you go, this isn't okay. I don't think it's okay, because I have a moral compass that agrees that we're morally equal, even if we're physically unequal. And it's our moral responsibility to grant to those weaker than us an equal seat at the table. And that is the wonder, if you will, of the story of Christianity, no matter how convoluted the process was to get there. The cool thing about the Bible, and again, the Bible it's man-made, it's man assembled at least. And it's got a lot of fudge factor, and it's got a lot of confirmation bias built into each rendition of it to create the narrative it was attempting to create. And yet, the story isn't so much about God. The story is about people, what people did because they had this notion of God. And we all woke up in one level or another. We all woke up inside of this story. We don't, we're trying to figure out what character we're playing here, or if we have a role or whatever, but we're real. We're really here, and we're inside of the story in the moment. And that's fascinating. And to me, it's frightening as hell if you lack the will to plunge into the unknown. And I understand that that's what causes people to want to ally themselves with ideologies and with theological regions of thought, or with ideological regions of thought, or anything that takes the burden off of them of owning their own rendition of why they're in the story. One of the things I used to do when I talked, and especially when I participated in atheist groups, which I don't do anymore, was say, well, the story of the three little pigs is very informative. You can walk up to, I was a foreman for many years on projects, and guys would say, do you think this is good enough? And I would walk up to them, and I really did this. I'd walk up to them and go, you remember the three little pigs? Which version do you think you just put together there? And if they had just built a house of sticks, they would go, okay, I'll do better. It's such a moral standard. It's such a touchstone and an icon. The three little pigs. I'm going to build it out. I'm going to build my hut from grass or sticks or stones, and everyone ends up in the house that's built of stones in the end. And he's wishing he made it a little bit bigger, maybe at that point. But the thing is that we can look at that and we can see the definitive nature of this story, and it means something to us. It means enough. You can go up to an educated, because electricians are educated, it's a little known fact. You can go up to an educated construction worker and say, and you don't answer them with chapter and verse in the code. which is bigger than the Bible, by the way, you just say, remember the 3 little pigs? What do you think you've got going here? And it would, I broke 50 people. I watched 50 people swear and then go, yeah, you're right. And that's all I ever had to do. And I think the Bible does that. I mean, it's little things like right now, the times we're living in. I don't read my Bible at all. I got a bunch of them, and I got an electronic one here, but I don't look at it. But I still remember things. And people say, well, why would you want to be prepared for the inevitable? It's coming up. And well, go to the Anto Slugger, consider your ways and be wise, having no chief master or ruler. These are, they're not God's icons. They're man's icons. These aren't touchstones for centering ourselves because God gave them to us necessarily. They're purely functional only within the bounds of humanity. They only work. They only orient themselves when people are the focus of the thing. And I think that's fascinating by itself. I mean, and I'll risk being short, missing something I want to say, but I hope I made the point there.
And I'll just have to hop off now, guys, because I've somewhere I have to be, unfortunately. But thank you very much for a very interesting discussion, and I'll catch what's left of it when you put it up, James. So
Lovely meeting you.
you
Thank
guys.
you, Connor.
Nice
Thank you
meeting you,
Yeah.
Nina and Terry. See you.
Thank you for joining us, Connor. Thank you.
Bye, Connor. Have a good night.
Yeah. Well, I think we can see an evolution of God, don't we, on how it looked, on how it changed, on how many they were, to the centralization of it, where now we have only one, right? And one God compared to the gods that we had in the past. And how God was maybe cruel, and wanted sacrifice in the past, but he doesn't want it now. Now it's all about love, and at least the highest and purest things that we see around us are associated with the idea of God. At least I do that, right? Like everything that is good and loving and forgiving and understanding is God itself, right? So we see God has evolved with the humans, and the need for that was, of course, because of controlling the behavior, right? So it's a tool to control behavior. That's why I'm saying, how much are we controlled by that tool, and how much we are changing, how much we are using the tool ourselves to actually progress, right? Yes, I suppose to progress. So I don't want to be changed by religion. I want to change religion. I don't want to be changed by God. I want to improve God. But of course it's not something that I should say in front of two believers, maybe. But I don't see God will stop from its evolution. I think it will continue to evolve and change, and we really have to be careful, because that will control the behavior of the people around us. And
Just a quick thing before you came on here, Nina, James had asked me when we didn't have the show running, he had asked me what I thought about God, and I don't think I probably ever at some point identified myself then or since as being a believer. I'm just trying to pay attention. So just for what it's worth, I just thought I'd toss that in there.
I'm not judging. So I've been a believer in my life. I've lost the faith, and then I've gained it back again, and now I lost it again. But what is important to me now, it's actually the understanding more than proving the existence of God or not. If God is love, then an understanding that that's what I want to inhabit myself, that love, that understanding, right? The concept itself. And yes, when we talk about behavior, it's whose behavior do we want to change? Because I want to control my own behavior, and I am not interested in controlling someone else's behavior. I do not believe they have to commit to the same ideas that I do. But on the other hand, I do not want other people to impose their behaviors on me, like certain religions do or certain people do. So again, it's the interaction with other people that I think it's important, and our well, what was the right word? Allowing ourselves to understand instead of judge, and instead of imposing our view. It's like, just, yes, other views are out there and that's fine. That it's moral. I don't know.
I think if you look at the evolution of gods, as you allude to, I think what's interesting about it, it's not quite like the evolution of technology. There were obvious cultural gods that were created, certainly by the Romans, by the Greeks, by the Norse civilizations, and others too, that embodied the human qualities and faults. They were a representation of things that are very human. And one of the challenging things about the Old Testament, particularly, as people often say, is that God in that seems quite harsh compared with the God of the New Testament. And of course, the Christian story has it that God doesn't change. And as Terry sort of alludes to, it's actually, in a sense, it's people changing, because God isn't actually changing. But there's a lovely line about when the incarnation happened, when Jesus came to earth as God in human flesh, which I like, and it's that their hearts were now ready for something more. And I think if you look at the Old Testament and some of the harsher injunctions in that, it's obvious that the Bible is a created artifact. It's part of fallenness. It's part of creation. It's not to be confused with God himself, as some Christians seem to. They seem to give it a status it's certainly inspired by God, I would say, but there's clearly so much human element in that. And that's why we get the things we get in it, the tribalism, the crystallization of things that took a long time to manifest. And over time, the obvious humanly created gods have died out, in that most, by and large, not always, but by and large, almost nobody believes in gods now that the Romans and the Greeks used to invent. Those gods they've undergone a kind of natural selection, whereby monotheism has been the primary god structure. And yet, unlike the trial and error of natural selection, and certainly in technology and other ethical structures, it hasn't always undergone improvement. As we've mentioned, there are certain religions that still are heavily propagated, that are growing in numbers, that are imposing themselves on nations with theocracies that are causing untold damage. So in one sense, we've got better at evolving gods. In another sense, it still led us off kilter. And a question that Nietzsche was interested in, with his famous God is Dead, is, well, if we do out-evolve Christianity, Nietzsche was very cynical about the Catholic Church, but in particular, as were some of the other great theistic writers. But he was concerned with what would replace a kind of world where those evolved structures, those hierarchy of structures, the almost metaphysically profound top of the structures, which of course the Christ figure represents in the incarnation, that if we didn't have those, what would we have instead? And of course, there are obviously extreme examples of where, extreme politics and extreme totalitarianism has manifested with the kind of, Nietzschean alternative, as we all know, particularly in the early 20th century. And that's where I go back to what I said in the last segment, that I don't think, however far we continue to evolve, and I think this is actually something that's a really profound truth about not just humanity, but existence itself, is that I don't think we're ever going to out-evolve the things that Christianity is nested in. And the thing that I really had to touch base with when I became a Christian about 20 years ago was that actually it does involve some of the things that we're a bit uncomfortable talking about, like, for example, that it is an emotional response,
Yes.
like the fact that it is a sense of faith in that one is trusting God. Now, obviously, we must immediately repudiate the nonsensical way that a lot of atheists condemn the word faith by saying, well, it's believing something without evidence. And one thing I probably meant to say at the beginning, which I'll say now on the basis of that, is that Christianity is a set of structures, and it's a worldview ultimately. And why I believe that Christ is God is it's based on a number of complex life experiences, thoughts, reasons, evidence. And therefore, I think we have to acknowledge, and this is probably a good place to acknowledge it, that there is a chasm, there's a Rubicon that's difficult to cross between a believer and an unbeliever, in that it's almost impossible for a Christian to convey to an unbeliever as to why they believe. And I think that's perhaps the thing over the centuries that has held back the dialogue. It's not that I can't make a good case for Christianity, it's that to simulate all of the reasons why I believe would involve spending an awful lot of time unpacking all that and compartmentalizing it almost into various lenses of interpretation of reality, which is what the book I'm writing attempts to do. But I don't think we're going to evolve anything superior to what we've already found to be the truth in Christ. I think
what we are trying to evolve is how do we interact with each other, believers and unbelievers. I think it's not the idea of God, as you said, that needs to evolve. It's how do we interpret God, what is God in our perception, and how do we relate to each other based on the idea of God or not. I am an atheist, but I am not against God, because I know there are outside there people like you whom have religious experience which are profound, and who am I to say, oh no, you're not right, I'm not there to live what you're living. And myself, I've had those stages where I was a believer and then not anymore. So I think what stands is how do we actually interact with each other? How do we evolve beyond? It's not how we evolve God, but how do we evolve ourselves in a way? You know, how do we get to accept that behavior that we need to control it's in ourselves and not in others? You know, because for example, if you look at, yes, we have centralized God, right? We have one single God, but each country has its own God, and those gods are fighting, you know. So it's how do we remove that fight, right? That's exactly how can we live peacefully with each other, knowing that certain people think differently than us, and that's fine.
Yeah, and I
Say
think
I'm sorry.
Go on.
What I just would, and we, both of you and I've alluded to as well, this evolution of thought that's brought us to the present. And aside from that, completely as a sidebar, humans are an evolved species, and to think that we're done would be silly. just setting that, put that in a box and set it over here, you know, that's on the back burner. We don't know what we're going to turn into, but it isn't this. That's interesting. But as far as philosophical evolution as it pertains to God, I had a very I was through an awful comedy of errors that doesn't have any point being brought up here. I found myself at the end of my line, approaching retirement, literally, I thought days away at the time, doing a job I said I would never do, just to get to retirement. And I'm at this job, and I'm pretty good with people, usually. I was at a public service desk at Walmart, and God help me, I was in the back, I was working in their tire and lube thing, just crossing the finish line. Again, doing the job. Never say you'll never do something, because you'll probably find yourself doing it, just to be humbled. But this guy that came in there often followed me out, and I went out to write up a vehicle, and he followed me out, and he was talkative, and he put his arm around me, which was, you know, kind of cool, because it's Minnesota, it's winter, you know, it's not so bad. It's January. And he says, I don't understand, man. He said, you're a great guy. You care about people. I care about you. You know, I just don't understand why you turned your back on God. And I said, why do you think I've done that? He says, well, you don't go to church, and you don't do these other things. And I said, did you ever think of it this way? That, you know, you've gone through in your life a series of things that have brought you to the present where you stand with God. I acknowledge that. But did you ever think that you could take another step? And if you took that other step, where you'd be? And he backed up, he started to cry, then he threw his arms around me, which is not a Minnesota thing to do, by the way, and said, thank you. I'd never thought of that in my life. And he had never considered that the same progression of events that brought him to Christianity didn't mean he had to desert that to take another step. You know, we have this story in the Bible, as you mentioned, Ian, that began with sacrifice and all this other crazy stuff that evolves itself to the point where Paul is talking to the Mars Hill. You know that unknown God? That's who I'm talking to you about today. And it blows their mind. They go, the unknown God? We didn't know what to say about the unknown God. And Paul says, I'm your man. I'm going to tell you about the unknown God. That's why I'm here today. The ultimate salesman. You know, oh, that's probably why they have me here. You know, let me tell you about the unknown God. And he takes it and he runs, and he inspires, at least it says in Acts, he gets their interest, which is no small thing, because these were very philosophical and learned people, and they wanted to hear all sorts of great stories. He told them the best story they'd ever heard. I think there's a point where we don't have to desert, by any means, desert the underpinnings that brought us to the moment, but nor do we have to stop in our tracks and go, I'm just waiting to die. And because I think there's, and this is my own spin on the thing, but there's always the next thing until we run out of time to have a next thing. And I think that, living in the anticipation of that next thing, it's a good thing. And that brings us, it's going to bring us all through a different route, which is back to what you're saying. How do we have these conversations, Nina?
Exactly.
We can't judge each other for being at a different spot on a different path.
Exactly.
That's ridiculous.
No, and that's one of my big experiences of Christians, of which I'm one, and trying to make sense of Scripture has been interesting, because I think it's been evident to me that, for understandable reasons, people look for the kind of God they want to see in Scripture in all sorts of ways, and that, of course, is fundamentally linked to their personality profile and what kind of people they are ultimately. And that's where you get some Christians who will see a very, judgmental God. Some will see a very loving and gracious God, and all kind of manner in between. I'm mindful of time, so I think it'd probably be a good place to close. But I think clearly from what we've discussed so far, I've been mindful of probably naming this part 1, because I think there's plenty more to unpack. And I guess I'll just finish with one quick observation that would lead us well into next time, perhaps, is that one of the misunderstandings, I think, of a lot of Christians, in my opinion, is when we talk about the notion of heaven and hell, and we hear people talk about heaven and hell as being almost distinct and distant places into which you will go as in your final destination if you believe or don't believe. And the church is very good at preaching that message in many denominations. My understanding of Scripture, which I think is, again, tapping into what we've talked about with the evolution of thought and the evolution of values and getting closer to the truth, is that when God came to earth as the living Christ and died for us, that is, as I say in my book, the point at which heaven and earth intersect. And it's the pivot around which the whole creation story revolves. And again, this is probably too much to get into now, but there's an element of the Leibnizian best of all possible worlds, which I discuss. In fact, I might even do a separate chat just on that, because it's really interesting. And I think we could have some great discussions about that. But the notion that heaven has come to earth and the kingdom of God is at hand is that actually we are called to create heaven as we live in, as Jesus says, the way, the truth, and the life. And as we know, we can make our life very much like heaven, very much like hell. And we can do that in various ways with just incidents or experiences or regrets, or everything we do to some extent is making us a little bit more heavenly or a little bit more hellish. And I think if we dovetail that to this evolution of thought, which we've talked about, which is ultimately what we're on a journey, we're on an adventure. This is an adventure of truth seeking. And one thing I think we all agree on, because I know you guys well enough, is that there's no greater adventure than seeking the truth and trying to explore that to its full heights and depths. And that's why Terry and I have got on so well over the years, and that's why, Nina, you and I, when we discuss anything that's socio-cultural, which we do mostly, we're pretty much on the same page, because we have that love of truth. And that sounds like a good place to end for now. So if you're happy, thank you so much for joining, and I will look forward to catching up with you guys in part 2. So thank you for your company. It's been great.
It was a pleasure, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.